On June 8, 1966, somewhere above the high desert of California, the most beautiful aircraft ever built by human hands was about to be destroyed. Not by a Soviet missile, not by an engine failure, not by the hostile sky that pilots fear most. It was going to be destroyed by a photograph, a corporate publicity photograph, commissioned to impress shareholders at a company dinner. The most advanced, most expensive, most revolutionary bomber in the history of American aviation, a machine that could fly at 3 times the speed of sound at the edge of space itself, would fall from the sky because someone wanted a nice picture. 2 men would die, and the most extraordinary aviation program of the entire Cold War, already canceled, already mourned, would suffer its final, definitive, heartbreaking blow. This is the story of the XB-70 Valkyrie. And if you think you already know how it ends, I promise you, you do not know half of it. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin in 1954, inside the offices of the Strategic Air Command, where a group of generals with stars on their shoulders and the weight of civilization on their minds are staring at a problem that has no easy solution. The year is 1954. The Korean War has just ended. The Cold War is at the beginning of what will become its most dangerous decade. The Soviet Union has detonated its first hydrogen bomb. The military calculus of the world has been fundamentally and permanently altered. And the generals of Strategic Air Command, the organization responsible for America's nuclear arsenal, are thinking very carefully about the future. The B-52 Stratofortress, the great 8-engine jet bomber that will eventually fly for longer than any aircraft in history, has just entered service. It is, by any standard, an extraordinary machine. But the generals are already looking past it. Because the problem with the B-52, as magnificent as it is this: it can be intercepted. Soviet radar can track it. Soviet fighters can reach it. Soviet surface-to-air missile systems, still primitive but developing rapidly, can potentially threaten it at altitude. And if the B-52 can be intercepted, then the mission it was built to fly, the nuclear strike mission deep into Soviet territory, becomes increasingly uncertain. The solution, as Strategic Air Command's Commander General Curtis LeMay and his planners see it, is to build a bomber that cannot be intercepted. Not a bomber that is hard to intercept. Not a bomber that requires more sophisticated Soviet technology to shoot down. A bomber that is, for all practical purposes, immune. A bomber that flies so fast and so high that no fighter in the world can catch it, that no surface-to-air missile yet in existence can reach it, that Soviet radar operators cannot track it quickly enough to position any defensive weapon in its path. A bomber that is, in the most literal possible sense, unstoppable. The requirement that emerges from this thinking is almost impossibly ambitious. Strategic Air Command wants a bomber that can cruise at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, more than 2,000 miles per hour. A bomber that can fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles above the Earth's surface. A bomber with intercontinental range, capable of flying from bases in the continental United States to targets deep inside the Soviet Union and returning without refueling. A bomber that can carry the most powerful nuclear weapons in the American arsenal. And a bomber that must fit the existing infrastructure of Strategic Air Command. The same hangars, the same runways, the same handling procedures used by the B-52. To put those performance requirements in perspective, Mach 3 at 70,000 feet in 1954 is not merely ambitious. It is the realm of science fiction. No aircraft in the world has ever flown at those speeds and altitudes in sustained, controlled, practical flight. The fastest fighters of the era top out at around Mach 1. Experimental rocket planes are pushing the boundaries, but they are tiny research vehicles, not vast nuclear bombers. What Strategic Air Command is asking for in 1954 is, in essence, a request to build an aircraft that is a full generation beyond anything that has ever flown. Not a marginal improvement. not an incremental advance. A quantum leap forward in every aspect of aviation technology simultaneously. And they want it operational within a decade. The competition for the contract to build this aircraft is fierce. Boeing, already building the B-52, enters the competition with their own designs. But the contract, announced on December 23, 1957, goes to North American Aviation, the same company that gave the world the P-51 Mustang in World War II, the F-86 Sabre that dominated the skies over Korea, and that would later build the Apollo command module that carried astronauts to the moon. North American Aviation is the most talented aerospace company in the world, and they are about to face the greatest engineering challenge in the history of flight. The aircraft that their engineers designed, under the leadership of Chief Designer Harrison Storms, is unlike anything that has come before it. It is called the B-70. It is given the name Valkyrie, the winged warrior women of Norse mythology who carried fallen heroes from the battlefield to Valhalla. The name is chosen from 20,000 entries submitted in a public competition, and it fits the aircraft perfectly. The Valkyrie is, quite genuinely, otherworldly. Let us talk about what makes the XB-70 Valkyrie so extraordinary, because understanding its engineering is understanding why the people who built it were so intensely proud of it, and why its eventual fate is so genuinely tragic. The first thing you notice about the Valkyrie is its sheer size. It is 185 feet long. To put that in context, the B-52 Stratofortress, already one of the largest bombers ever built, is about 160 feet long. The Valkyrie is longer. Its wingspan is 105 feet, narrower than the B-52's massive 185-foot wingspan, reflecting the very different aerodynamic requirements of supersonic flight. It weighs over 500,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel. It carries 6 engines. 6 enormous General Electric YJ-93 GE-3 turbojets, each producing approximately 28,000 to 30,000 pounds of thrust. Together, these 6 engines produce more thrust than almost anything that has ever flown. They are not merely propulsion systems. They are power plants of extraordinary complexity, designed to operate at conditions of heat and pressure that would destroy conventional jet engines. At Mach 3, the leading edges of an aircraft's wings and nose heat up due to air friction to temperatures that would melt aluminum, the material that virtually all aircraft of the era are built from. The XB-70's skin temperature in sustained Mach 3 flight exceeds 600 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not a problem that can be solved with better aluminum. You need different materials entirely. North American Aviation's engineers solved this by building the Valkyrie from stainless steel, sandwiched honeycomb panels of stainless steel that provide the structural strength required while managing the thermal loads. They also use titanium in the hottest areas. The result is an aircraft that is, in terms of its materials and construction methods, decades ahead of anything else flying in the early 1960s. But the most extraordinary engineering innovation of the XB-70 is not its materials. It is how it flies. The Valkyrie uses a principle called compression lift, and it is so clever, so counterintuitive, and so elegant that it is worth taking a few moments to really understand it. At supersonic speeds, an aircraft creates a powerful shock wave. This shock wave radiates outward and downward from the aircraft's nose and the leading edges of its wings. The shock wave is a region of highly compressed, high-pressure air. In conventional supersonic aircraft design, this shock wave is simply a byproduct of flight, something you have to live with and work around. But the designers of the XB-70 realized something remarkable. If you shape the aircraft correctly, if you design it so that the shock wave is trapped underneath the aircraft's wings and fuselage, you can use that high-pressure compressed air to generate additional lift. You are literally riding your own shock wave, surfing through the sky on a wave of your own creation, using it to carry part of your own weight. This is what compression lift means. And for the XB-70, flying at Mach 3, the compression lift generated by riding the shock wave provides a significant portion of the total lift the aircraft needs to stay airborne. This allows the engineers to design a smaller, more aerodynamically clean wing, reducing drag, while still generating enough lift to carry the aircraft's enormous weight. The Valkyrie's delta wing, with its distinctive hinged outer sections that fold downward in supersonic flight to help capture and channel the shock wave, is the physical expression of this principle. There is another detail of the aircraft's thermal management that reveals the ingenuity of its design. At Mach 3, the fuel in the aircraft's tanks, which is essentially cooler than the surrounding structure, can be used as a coolant. The XB-70's designers ran fuel through heat exchangers in the aircraft's skin and structure, using it to absorb heat from the airframe and carry it away before pumping it to the engines. The fuel itself becomes part of the cooling system. The aircraft manages its own temperature by circulating fuel through its structure, and by the time the fuel reaches the engines, it has already done double duty as both propellant and coolant. It is a closed-loop thermal management system of remarkable elegance, and it was decades ahead of its time. The cockpit of the XB-70 reflects the same commitment to solving problems that no one had ever had to solve before. Because at Mach 3 and 70,000 feet, the environment outside the aircraft is lethal in ways that go beyond the obvious. The temperature outside is around minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure is so low that without pressurization, you would lose consciousness within seconds. But there is another problem. At those speeds, the cockpit windows, if designed conventionally, would heat up to temperatures that would make them optically useless or structurally compromised. The engineers designed special windows that can withstand the thermal and pressure environment while still providing the pilots with a view of the outside world. The pilots themselves fly in what amounts to a shirt-sleeve environment inside the cockpit, because the entire aircraft is designed to maintain comfortable conditions for them despite the impossible conditions outside. The XB-70 also carries an IBM-developed bombing and navigation system that incorporates gyro-stabilized inertial navigation alongside automatic star tracking. The star tracking system uses celestial navigation to continuously update the aircraft's position, a precursor to the kind of navigation systems that would eventually evolve into GPS. The radar system is described as having imaging quality comparable to taking a photograph. It is, in every sense, the most advanced aircraft electronics system ever put into an operational platform at the time it was developed. The bomb bay of the XB-70 is approximately 30 feet long, large enough to accommodate any nuclear weapon in the American arsenal. The plan is for the Valkyrie to carry thermonuclear weapons of extraordinary destructive power, flying them at Mach 3 over the Arctic and into Soviet airspace, releasing them at altitude, and then using its speed to outrun the effects of the blast. There is a sobering detail here that tells you something about the nature of nuclear war in the early 1960s. One of the operational scenarios for the B-70 involves the aircraft flying a one-way mission. The pilot would drop the weapon and then attempt to escape at maximum speed. Whether he could outrun the fireball of a thermonuclear detonation at those speeds was, in the calculations of the time, uncertain. North American aviation's engineers are so confident in their design, so proud of what they have built on paper, that the B-70 program generates an almost religious fervor within the company. This is going to be the greatest aircraft ever built. This is going to change the world. The USAF plans to buy as many as 65 operational bombers. Strategic Air Command will have a fleet of Valkyries that no Soviet defense system can touch. American nuclear deterrence will rest on a foundation of pure speed and pure altitude, a technological achievement so far beyond anything the Soviets can match that the balance of power will be permanently, decisively altered in America's favor. And then, one by one, The assumptions on which all of this is built begin to collapse. The first blow comes not from a Soviet achievement, but from an American one. In 1957, the United States successfully tests its first intercontinental ballistic missile. The Atlas ICBM can carry a nuclear warhead from the United States to the Soviet Union in about 30 minutes. It needs no pilot. It cannot be intercepted by fighters. It requires no airfield, no crew, no mission planning in the traditional sense. And compared to an enormously expensive fleet of Mach 3 bombers, each one requiring a massive support infrastructure of maintenance facilities and trained crews, the ICBM is relatively cheap. The question that immediately occurs to everyone who thinks seriously about nuclear strategy is this. If you have ICBMs that can reach the Soviet Union in 30 minutes without any of the risks and costs associated with manned bombers, why do you need the manned bombers at all? This question does not kill the XB-70 program immediately. The arguments for manned bombers are real and significant, including the crucial ability to recall a bomber that has been launched but whose mission has been aborted by last-minute diplomacy, something you cannot do with a missile once it has been fired. But it plants a seed of doubt that will grow throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The second blow is more concrete and more immediately alarming. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile, specifically an SA-2 guideline, shoots down a Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over the Soviet Union. The U-2, piloted by CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers, is flying at approximately 70,000 feet. 70,000 feet. The exact altitude that the XB-70 is designed to cruise at. And the Soviet missile has just demonstrated, in the most definitive way possible, that 70,000 feet is not beyond the reach of Soviet air defenses. The shootdown does not prove that the XB-70 would be vulnerable. The XB-70 would be flying much faster than the U-2 and would have different defensive capabilities, but it shatters the fundamental assumption of invulnerability on which the entire program is based. The idea that speed and altitude alone guarantee survivability is suddenly, shockingly, visibly wrong. The third blow is political, and it comes from an unexpected direction. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, appointed by President Kennedy in January 1961, is a man who approaches military procurement with the eye of a businessman and the tools of an economist. He looks at the XB-70 program, and he sees an aircraft that costs an extraordinary amount of money, that is becoming strategically obsolete before it has even flown, and that represents a way of thinking about nuclear deterrence that he regards as increasingly outdated. McNamara is a champion of what he calls flexible response, the idea that the United States needs military options across the entire spectrum of conflict, not just a massive nuclear strike capability. He is also a champion of the ICBM as the backbone of nuclear deterrence. And he is deeply skeptical of the argument that spending billions of dollars on a Mach 3 bomber that might be vulnerable to Soviet SAMs represents sound defense policy. In 1961, McNamara and the Kennedy administration canceled the XB-70 production program. No fleet of 65 operational bombers. No Valkyrie wing in Strategic Air Command. The program is reduced to a research effort. 2 prototype aircraft, designated XB-70A, will be built and used to gather data on sustained Mach 3 flight. The knowledge gained may be useful for future aircraft programs, for the American Supersonic Transport Project, for materials science and aerodynamics research. But the XB-70 as a weapon, as the centerpiece of America's nuclear deterrent, is finished. The reaction within the Air Force and at North American aviation is one of genuine anguish. General Curtis LeMay, the legendary commander of Strategic Air Command, fights the cancellation with everything he has. He testifies before Congress. He argues passionately for the bomber's strategic value. He points out that bombers and missiles are complementary, not competing. that a diverse nuclear deterrent with both manned platforms and ICBMs is more credible and more resilient than one that depends entirely on missiles. He is right about some things and wrong about others, and in the end, it does not matter. The decision is made. The program is canceled, and yet the aircraft continues to be built. Because 2 prototypes have been authorized, 2 flying laboratories, 2 extraordinary machines that will go into the sky and demonstrate what Mach 3 actually looks like in practice, what it feels like, what problems it creates, what it teaches you about how to build the next generation of high-speed aircraft. The first XB-70A prototype, given the designation Air Vehicle 1, rolls out of North American Aviation's facility at Palmdale, California, in May 1964. The sight of it stops people in their tracks. It is brilliant white, the color chosen because white reflects thermal radiation better than darker colors, reducing heat absorption in flight. It is 185 feet of angular, knife-edged, utterly alien-looking aircraft, simultaneously the most futuristic and the most beautiful thing most of the people who see it have ever laid eyes on. The canard foreplanes ahead of the main delta wing give it an aggressive, forward-leaning posture, as if the aircraft is straining to go faster even while standing still. The 6 engines buried in the massive underbelly intake give the aircraft's profile a unique, almost insectoid quality from certain angles. Everything about the XB-70 looks fast. Everything about it looks like nothing else. On September 21st, 1964, Air Vehicle 1 makes its first flight, lifting off from Air Force Plant 42 at Palmdale and flying to Edwards Air Force Base. The test pilots in the cockpit are North American Aviation's Colonel Alvin Al White and Air Force Colonel Joe Cotton. The flight is a success. The aircraft handles well. The systems perform. The Valkyrie is airborne. Over the following months, the flight test program progresses carefully and systematically. Each flight pushes the performance envelope a little further. The engineers track every data point, every temperature reading, every stress measurement, building up a picture of how this extraordinary machine actually behaves in flight. There are problems, as there always are with experimental aircraft pushing the absolute frontier of what is possible. On May 7, 1965, a 3-foot piece of the wing apex breaks off in flight and causes extensive damage to 5 of the 6 engines. This is a serious incident, and the program pauses while the engines are repaired and the aircraft is inspected. But it is not the kind of failure that stops a test program. It is the kind of failure that teaches you something important. The engineers learn, and the program continues. On October 14, 1965, Air Vehicle 1 surpasses Mach 3 for the first time. The pilots bring the aircraft to 3 times the speed of sound, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, everything the engineers have worked for, everything the designers have dreamed of, everything the test pilots have trained for, becomes real. Mach 3, more than 2,000 miles per hour, faster than a rifle bullet. The Valkyrie is flying at the speed it was born to fly. But the flight also reveals a problem. The heat and stress of sustained Mach 3 flight damages the honeycomb panels in Air Vehicle 1's wings, leaving sections of the leading edge missing. The aircraft is subsequently limited to Mach 2.5 for its remaining flights. Air Vehicle 1 will never again fly at its design speed. The second prototype, Air Vehicle 2, is a more refined aircraft, incorporating improvements learned from Air Vehicle 1's early flights. Air Vehicle 2 achieves sustained Mach 3 flight, and, on May 19, 1966, sustains Mach 3 for 32 minutes, a remarkable demonstration of what the aircraft is capable of when everything works as designed. 32 minutes at over 2,000 miles per hour, riding the shock wave of its own creation across the stratosphere. So high that the curvature of the Earth is visible, so fast that the entire state of California passes beneath you in minutes. There is genuinely nothing else like it in the history of flight. The data from these flights is extraordinary. The engineers are learning things about Mach 3 flight that simply cannot be learned any other way. The behavior of structures at extreme temperatures. The aerodynamic phenomena unique to sustained supersonic cruise. The interaction between the aircraft's shock wave and its own flight characteristics. The material's performance under conditions that laboratory tests can only approximate. All of this information is being collected, analyzed, and fed into the next generation of high-speed aviation programs, including America's Supersonic Transport Project, the program to build a civilian aircraft capable of flying passengers at supersonic speeds, and ultimately, through channels both direct and indirect, into the designs of the State Route 71 Blackbird and the Concorde. There is also an intelligence dimension to the XB-70 story that deserves acknowledgement. The existence of the Valkyrie program and its evident capabilities drives the Soviet Union to develop a response. Soviet aerospace engineers, alarmed by an American aircraft that can fly at Mach 3 and 70,000 feet, design and build the MiG-25 Foxbat Interceptor, one of the fastest military aircraft ever built, capable of Mach 3.2 at altitude, specifically to counter the threat the B-70 represents. The Soviets also develop and refine their surface-to-air missile systems. In a very real sense, the XB-70 shapes Soviet military aviation even without ever flying a single operational mission. And then comes June 8, 1966, and everything changes. Let us go back to that day in detail, because it deserves to be understood fully, and because understanding it completely changes how you feel about the Valkyrie program and the people who lived and died inside it. Air Vehicle 2, the second and more capable of the two XB-70 prototypes, is approaching the end of its time with North American aviation. The Air Force is planning to transfer it to NASA in June 1966, where it will become part of the agency's Supersonic Transport Research Program. Before that handover, a photo opportunity is planned. General Electric, the manufacturer of the engines powering the XB-70, wants a publicity photograph for a corporate event for its shareholders. The concept is straightforward and, in aviation publicity terms, genuinely compelling. Get 5 aircraft together that are all powered by General Electric engines, fly them in close formation, and capture the image. The 5 aircraft are the XB-70 Valkyrie itself, an F-4B Phantom, a Northrop YF-5A Freedom Fighter, a Northrop T-38A Talon Trainer, and a Lockheed F-104N Starfighter, all 5 powered by GE engines, all 5 representing different aspects of American aerospace achievement. The flight is arranged. The paperwork, it will later emerge, does not fully follow established Air Force procedures for requesting and approving publicity flights. There is reason to believe, based on subsequent investigations, that had proper procedures been followed, this particular flight might not have been approved. But the paperwork is not fully followed, and the flight is scheduled for June 8, 1966. The pilot in the left seat of Air Vehicle 2, the command pilot, is Major Carl Cross of the United States Air Force. Cross is an experienced test pilot. In the right seat is North American Aviation's Alvin "Al" White, the lead test pilot for the XB-70 program, a man who has accumulated more hours in the Valkyrie than any other human being alive. Together, these 2 men have as much experience and expertise in this aircraft as anyone on Earth. Flying the F-104N Starfighter in the formation is Joe Walker. Let me tell you about Joe Walker, because his story is essential to understanding the full tragedy of what is about to happen. Joe Walker is one of the most extraordinary test pilots in American history. He is the chief research test pilot at NASA's Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base. He holds the world altitude record for a winged aircraft. He has flown the X-15 rocket plane to an altitude of over 67 miles, high enough to qualify as spaceflight under the standards used at the time. He has flown the X-15 15 at speeds exceeding Mach 5. He has flown the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, the machine built to teach astronauts how to land on the moon. He is, by any measure, among the finest and most experienced test pilots in the world. He has been asked to fly one of the escort aircraft in this formation. He has agreed. He is flying the F-104N, the photo chase aircraft. The aircraft from which the photographs will actually be taken is a Learjet. Specifically, it is a Learjet owned by none other than Frank Sinatra, the singer, hired for the day to serve as the photography platform. Clay Lacy, one of the most accomplished ferry and demonstration pilots in aviation, is at the controls. In the back, photographers with still cameras and motion picture film cameras are setting up to capture the formation. The formation assembles over the California high desert, approximately 17 miles northeast of Barstow, at an altitude of 32,000 feet. The 5 aircraft arrange themselves in a wedge behind and around the great white XB-70, the smaller fighters flanking the bomber like an honor guard. From outside, the formation is breathtaking. The enormous white Valkyrie anchoring the center, the sleek fighters arranged around it, everything moving in formation through the blue California sky. The photographs are taken. The motion picture cameras roll. The image is captured in those minutes. The 5 aircraft in perfect formation, the massive white XB-70 surrounded by its smaller companions, are genuinely beautiful. They are among the most iconic aviation photographs ever taken, and they capture the very last minutes of the XB-70 Air Vehicle 2 in flight. What happens next takes approximately 1 second. Joe Walker's F-104N, flying off the XB-70's right wing, drifts slightly toward the bomber. The subsequent investigation will determine that Walker was maintaining his position in the formation by using the XB-70's fuselage as a visual reference, looking forward at the body of the bomber rather than back at the wing. Because of this, he was unable to properly perceive his position relative to the Valkyrie's right wing, which extended behind and beside him. He was approximately 70 feet to the side and 10 feet below the XB-70's fuselage. That sounds like sufficient clearance. But the XB-70's wing extended well beyond that point, and Walker could not see it from his cockpit position without craning uncomfortably backward over his shoulder. What no one has adequately accounted for in planning this formation is the wingtip vortex of the XB-70. At the tip of any aircraft's wing, the high-pressure air beneath the wing curls up around the tip to meet the low-pressure air above, creating a rotating column of air, a vortex, that spins downward and outward behind the wing. In large aircraft, these wingtip vortices are powerful enough to flip a smaller aircraft if it flies too close. The XB-70, with its enormous delta wing and its extraordinary weight, generates wingtip vortices of unusual strength. As Walker's F-104 flies just off the Valkyrie's right wingtip, those vortices catch his aircraft. Without warning, without any input from Walker, the F-104 is pulled upward and inward toward the bomber. Walker has no time to react. His aircraft clips the XB-70's right wingtip, then rolls up and over the top of the Valkyrie. The horizontal stabilizer of the F-104, mounted high on its vertical tail, contacts the leading edge of the XB-70's outer wing twice. First a glancing touch, then a solid impact, hard enough to leave a distinct scratch mark in the shape of the letter S across the wing's leading edge. The momentum of the F-104 carries it up and over, and as it rolls inverted above the Valkyrie's back, it strikes the aircraft's right vertical stabilizer, shears off most of the left vertical stabilizer, and then careens off the left wing. The F-104 explodes instantly. A ball of fire. Joe Walker, one of the greatest test pilots America has ever produced, a man who flew to the edge of space and back, dies in that instant without warning, without pain, without any possibility of escape. Air Force pilot Captain Pete Hogue, flying the T-38A in the formation, shouts over the radio, "Mid-air! Mid-air!" For 16 seconds after the collision, the XB-70 continues to fly. This is, in a strange way, remarkable. The aircraft has just lost both of its vertical stabilizers, the structures that provide directional stability and control. It has damage to its wing. It is streaming JP-8 fuel from ruptured tanks. And for 16 seconds, it holds together. It flies straight and level. Al White and Carl Cross, in the cockpit, are surrounded by warning lights and alarms. They know the aircraft is severely damaged. They may not yet know how severely. Then the XB-70 begins to roll, slowly at first, then faster. The loss of the vertical stabilizers means the aircraft has no directional control. It is rolling to the left, going inverted, the nose dropping, the aircraft beginning the long, spiraling fall toward the desert thousands of feet below. "Eject! Eject! Eject!" shouts a chase pilot over the radio. Al White ejects. His ejection capsule, the XB-70, uses an enclosed ejection system rather than an open ejection seat, because ejecting at high speed from an aircraft would mean instant fatal deceleration for an unprotected pilot. Fires and carries him clear of the tumbling wreckage. He survives, but the capsule malfunctions as it deploys, and White sustains severe injuries in the landing. He will recover, but his career as a test pilot is effectively over. Carl Cross does not eject. Whether he could not reach the controls in time, whether something prevented the system from functioning, whether the violence of the aircraft's gyrations made ejection impossible, the investigation will never fully and definitively explain why Cross did not escape. He remains in the aircraft as it spirals down, through the blue sky, over the brown desert, and crashes into the ground north of Barstow, California. He dies with the Valkyrie. The official investigation will later conclude that the accident was caused by the F-104 entering the XB-70's wingtip vortex, and that the formation had been set up in a way that made Walker's spatial disorientation possible. It will also note, carefully and specifically, that the proper Air Force procedures for approving publicity flights had not been followed. This flight, the investigation implies, probably should not have been flown in the way it was flown. A $4 billion aircraft and two extraordinary human beings were lost, ultimately, for a corporate photograph. Joe Walker was 51 years old when he died. Carl Cross was 35. Walker left behind a wife and 3 children. He had flown higher and faster than almost any human being alive. He deserved a better end. They both did. The surviving XB-70 Air Vehicle 1, the first prototype, the one limited to Mach 2.5 by the damage it had sustained earlier in the program, continued to fly for 3 more years. NASA used it for supersonic transport research, accumulating data that contributed to the understanding of high-speed flight that would eventually inform the Concorde program and the American SST effort. On February 4, 1969, Air Vehicle 1 made its final flight, landing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It was towed to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it remains on display to this day. It is the only XB-70 Valkyrie in existence. The only survivor of a program that cost billions of dollars, produced 2 of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, and ended with the loss of 1 aircraft, the deaths of 2 exceptional men, and the quiet, unheralded conclusion of the most ambitious bomber program in the history of American aviation. What is the legacy of the XB-70 Valkyrie? This is a question worth sitting with, because the Valkyrie's legacy is more complex and more interesting than a simple story of Cold War failure would suggest. The most obvious legacy is what it was not. It was not a production bomber. It never entered service with Strategic Air Command. It never flew a nuclear mission. The 65-plane fleet that General LeMay envisioned never materialized. In the most direct sense, the XB-70 was a program that failed to achieve its primary purpose. But that is only one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at the Valkyrie is to see it as a program that succeeded spectacularly at the actual job it was ultimately tasked with, generating knowledge about high-speed flight. The data from the XB-70 test program fed directly into the development of the State Route 71 Blackbird, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever flown in operational service. It contributed to the American SST program, which, though ultimately canceled for reasons unrelated to the technology, established a significant body of aeronautical knowledge. It influenced the development of the B-1 bomber, the aircraft that eventually became the strategic bomber that the B-70 was supposed to be. It informed materials science and thermal engineering in ways that ripple through aerospace design to this day. There is also an unexpected international legacy. Through the channels of Cold War espionage, elements of the technology and design philosophy embodied in the XB-70 found their way to the Soviet Union, contributing to the development of the Tupolev Tu-144, the Soviet supersonic transport that flew before the Concorde. The Valkyrie shadow falls across the entire history of supersonic aviation on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And then there is the legacy of deterrence itself. The XB-70 program, like so many Cold War programs, must be understood in the context of the larger competition it was part of. The Soviet Union spent significant resources developing the MiG-25 Foxbat specifically to counter the B-70 threat. Resources that went to the Foxbat did not go to other Soviet military programs. In this sense, the B-70 program, even in its canceled and reduced form, performed a deterrence function simply by existing, by forcing Soviet planners to respond to a threat that ultimately never materialized. This kind of strategic diversion is difficult to quantify, but it is real. There is also something to be said for what the Valkyrie represents in purely human terms. It represents a moment when the ambitions of engineers and the resources of a nation came together to attempt something genuinely extraordinary. The people who designed and built the XB-70 were trying to create the most advanced aircraft in the history of human flight. They largely succeeded on the engineering level. They produced an aircraft that did exactly what they said it would do, flew at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet, riding its own shock wave across the stratosphere. The fact that the strategic world had changed around it before it could prove its value as a weapon does not diminish the engineering achievement. It diminishes the program's strategic relevance, but it does not diminish the brilliance and dedication of the people who built it. Curtis LeMay's famous dismissal of an early B-70 concept, "This isn't an airplane, it's a three-ship formation," referring to the massive external fuel tanks the early design required, was both funny and technically astute. But by the time the actual XB-70 was flying, LeMay's dismissal no longer applied. The final aircraft was a coherent, integrated, extraordinary machine. It was not three ships. It was one ship, and it was magnificent. Think for a moment about what it must have been like to fly the Valkyrie. To sit in that cockpit at 70,000 feet, above almost all of the atmosphere, with the curvature of the Earth visible through the windows, the sky above you fading from blue to the deep, dark indigo that borders on space itself, and to have the throttles forward and the Mach meter reading 2,000 miles per hour. The equivalent of covering the distance from New York to Los Angeles in under 90 minutes. The entire country sliding past beneath you at a rate that no human being before the 1960s could have imagined possible. The aircraft beneath you trembling slightly with the forces acting on it, the temperature of its skin building towards 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the 6 engines behind you producing a combined thrust that no bomber has ever matched before or since. What must that have felt like? The pilots who flew it speak of it with a reverence that is different from the way pilots speak of other aircraft. It is not merely enthusiasm for a capable machine. It is something deeper, The acknowledgement that this aircraft was operating at the absolute edge of what human beings and human technology had achieved. It was the frontier. It was the furthest point. It was the Mach 3 edge of the envelope. And the people who flew it knew they were standing at a place where very few human beings had ever stood. There is a footnote to the XB-70 story that connects it to the broader history of American aviation in a way that is almost poetic. The State Route 71 Blackbird, the aircraft that in many ways inherited the Valkyrie's mantle as America's ultimate high-speed aircraft, first flew in December 1964, just months after the XB-70 made its own first flight. The two programs overlapped. In some ways they competed. In other ways, the knowledge generated by one fed directly into the capabilities of the other. The State Route 71 would go on to achieve operational service, flying reconnaissance missions for decades and accumulating speed and altitude records that remain unmatched today. The XB-70 never achieved operational service, but the line between them is clear and direct. The Valkyrie taught the engineers and designers of the Blackbird things they could not have learned any other way. And there is a broader lesson in the XB-70 story that applies not just to aviation, but to any program that attempts to build something at the absolute frontier of what is possible. The Valkyrie failed as a weapon because the strategic context that justified its existence changed faster than the program could respond. This is not a failure of engineering. It is a failure of timing. Had the B-70 been available in 1950, before ICBMs existed and before Soviet surface-to-air missiles could reach altitude, it would almost certainly have entered service and transformed the nuclear balance of power. Had it been delayed another decade, the world into which it emerged might have found a different role for it. As a supersonic transport demonstrator, as a reconnaissance platform, as something we cannot fully predict. But the B-70 emerged into the world at precisely the moment when everything it was built for was becoming obsolete, and it could not survive that moment. This is a pattern that recurs throughout military history, and indeed throughout the history of technology. The weapon or the tool that arrives too late, or too early, or precisely at the moment when the conditions that justified its creation are dissolving. The cavalry charge and the machine gun, the battleship and the aircraft carrier, the Maginot Line and the tank, and the XB-70 Valkyrie, flying at Mach 3 and 70,000 feet, in a world that no longer needed Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. Today, the surviving XB-70 stands in the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. It is displayed in a hall large enough to hold it. Barely. And it draws visitors who have never heard of it and leaves them standing open-mouthed at its presence. Because whatever you know about the XB-70's history, whatever you understand about its strategic irrelevance and its programmatic failure, nothing fully prepares you for the experience of standing next to it. 185 feet of white, angular, knife-edged, alien-looking aircraft, built from materials that were cutting-edge 60 years ago, designed to a standard of performance that most aircraft will never match. It sits there in the museum, in the permanent display that also holds the State Route 71 and the B-2 and the B-17 and every other significant aircraft in American aviation history. And it is somehow the most extraordinary thing in the room. There is one final aspect of the XB-70 story that I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something essential about what this aircraft means and why it matters. On that June day in 1966, when the cameras were rolling and the formation was assembled over the California desert, the people on the Learjet took photographs that are now among the most famous in aviation history. One image in particular, taken in the final minutes before the collision, shows all 5 aircraft in perfect formation. The great white Valkyrie at the center, the 4 smaller aircraft arranged around it like an honor guard of speed. It is, objectively, one of the most beautiful aviation photographs ever taken. Every aircraft in pristine condition. Every pilot alive and flying and doing what they were born to do. The California sky blue and perfect around them. And then, 1 minute after the motion picture cameras were turned off, it was gone. The formation dissolved in fire and falling wreckage. 2 men died. The most extraordinary bomber program in American history lost its second and final flying prototype. The photograph survives as a record of the last perfect moment, the instant before the end, frozen in time in a way that makes it simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. That photograph is, in many ways, the truest image of the Cold War itself. The beauty and the terror, the extraordinary human achievement and the terrible human cost. The technology that could outrun anything and yet could not outrun the changing world. The Valkyrie, perfect and white and impossible, hovering at the edge of forever and then gone. The XB-70 Valkyrie was the fastest bomber ever built. It was the highest flying bomber ever built. It rode its own shock wave across the stratosphere at speeds that still have not been surpassed by a production bomber 60 years later. It died not in combat, not in the service of the mission it was born for, but in the service of a corporate publicity photograph. And the world it was built to fly and was already dissolving before it ever really flew. It deserved better. The men who flew it deserved better. Carl Cross deserved better. Joe Walker, the man who flew to the edge of space and died in a formation over the California desert, deserved better. But the Valkyrie gave us everything it had. It flew at Mach 3. It touched the edge of space. It taught us things we needed to know. And it stands in its museum today, white and extraordinary and silent, a monument to the moment when human ambition and human engineering reached for the absolute limit of what was possible, and for 32 extraordinary minutes over the American sky, found it. So here is the question I want to leave you with. In an age of stealth aircraft and hypersonic missiles and drone warfare, in a world where speed and altitude are no longer the only answers to the challenge of air defense penetration, do you think the philosophy of the XB-70, the idea that you can fly fast enough and high enough to be genuinely invulnerable, will ever come back? Or has the Valkyrie's era of pure speed as the ultimate defense forever closed? Leave your answer below. This community has some of the most knowledgeable and passionate aviation and military history minds I have encountered anywhere, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story moved you the way it moves me, share it. The XB-70 Valkyrie deserves to be remembered. The people who built it deserve to be remembered. Carl Cross and Joe Walker deserve to be remembered. And subscribe, because we have more stories like this one, stories of extraordinary machines, and the extraordinary people who flew them, waiting for you.